Recording. Welcome everybody. My name is Mark Schwartz. I'm the host for today's seminar on emerging issues in conservation, sponsored by the Society for Conservation Biology. Martin Strauss, the series organizer, is out in the field, and so I'm filling in for him a bit today. I'm the editor-in-chief at Conservation Science and Practice. Martin has been organizing these seminars. They've been really great. It's been fun to see all the great work coming out. Weekly, we're featuring papers that are appearing in Conservation Biology, Conservation Letters, and Conservation Science and Practice. And as editor-in-chief, I was contacted by the folks at Revive and Restore many months ago now, that they wanted to do a special issue, having had a workshop on intended consequences in conservation. And it was just a joy to work with these folks on getting this thing together. And it's an issue that I'm very proud of. And so we've invited them in to talk about it. It came out, Michele, you're going to have to remind me that it was April's issue. April's issue. Okay. So we're going to have a little bit of a different kind of seminar today, in that there'll be more than one speaker. And so we're going to go into some questions at the end of different sections, but we're going to transition on time so that we have plenty of time for questions at the end. So feel free to drop your questions into the chat box. We'll moderate the questions as we go along and try and keep track of them and get everyone an opportunity to ask their questions. And when I call on you to ask your questions, you can just turn your video on and ask it live. That would be great. But with that, I think I'll hand it off to Michele and have at it.
Thank you so much, Mark. Ben, if you could share my slides, please. My name is Michele Weber. I'm the Director of Conservation Innovation at Revive and Restore. And Revive and Restore is a small nonprofit. We are working to bring biotechnology to conservation. And I'm going to talk to you today about intended consequences. Just introduce you to the topic before you hear from the folks that wrote the papers that are part of the issue that Mark introduced. So go ahead and advance, Ben. All right, so talking about planning conservation interventions. This process involves asking a lot of questions, and so often we start with the science. So here are a couple of examples. Can we restore California condors by bringing the last individuals into captivity? Can we reintroduce wolves to Yellowstone? Can we use genetic engineering to help the American chestnut tolerate an invasive pathogen? So these three are quite famous stories. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. And I think at this point, we can answer yes to those questions. Advance, please. But the next set of questions get more complicated. Should we restore California condors? Should we reintroduce wolves? And should we use genetic engineering to help the American chestnut? So these questions and this part of the decision-making process gets a little bit more complicated. And so when you move from figuring out whether the science is possible to the implementation step, then you start hearing some familiar responses. Next, please. So any of you that have been involved in conservation interventions have probably heard some of these questions. Things like, what could possibly go wrong with your plan? Aren't you playing God? And then this last one in blue, what about the unintended consequences? And this is a question that is so familiar to so many of us that work in this field. And this is really what inspired our thinking about intended consequences. Next, please. So intended consequences is meant to be a deliberate counterweight to really help us consider alternatives to these reflexive responses. So alternatives like intervention can benefit nature. Inaction is a choice and it has its own consequences. Values matter, worldviews matter, and there's a diversity of opinions that also influence decision-making. So intended consequences really about helping to rebalance the risk-benefit equation to give additional consideration to the benefits of intervention and the costs of inaction. And these are just a few of the themes. Next, please. And as Mark mentioned, we brought a bunch of people together to talk about all of this at a workshop that happened in June 2020. And one of the silver linings from the COVID-19 situation is that we were actually able to include almost 60 people in this conversation from all different corners of conservation thinking: biologists, practitioners, social scientists. And we really hashed through these themes and thought about what we meant when we said intended consequences. Next, please. So the special issue that just came out in April, thank you so much, Mark, for all your help with this. There's 11 different papers in here that tackle various issues and aspects related to intended consequences. You're going to hear briefly about just a few of them today, but we really hope that this will be a first step in expanding the narrative for conservation and moving past some of the really strict interpretations of the precautionary principle. Next, please. So shortly after the workshop, a large majority of the participants got together, and through quite an impressive consensus process, we put together the intended consequences statements. And these are 8 points of agreement that we really think will be critical in terms of guiding our intended consequences thinking as we are working to expand this narrative for conservation. So I just put 3 of the ideas here, 3 of the themes. There is much more to this. You know where to find it on the SCB website. And I would also just say that if you go to our website, you can add your name to a growing list of people that that are supportive of this intended consequences idea in this next phase for conservation. Next. So I'm going to introduce the 2 speakers. We're going to start with Claire. She's going to talk to you about her paper, Concern over Hybridization Risks Should Not Preclude Conservation Interventions. I think she will help convince you that values matter and that they are a big part of this conversation. Next, please. And then we are going to hear from Ben Novak, who will talk about US conservation translocations over a century of intended consequences. And I think that his review will convince you that interventions can and do benefit nature. So I'm just going to read a brief introduction to Claire. You can stop sharing, Ben. And then we'll let you take it away. Claire, are you here and ready to go?
Yes. I'm ready to go.
Okay, let me just let people know who you are, and then you can go ahead and share your slides. So Claire Hirashiki is a science specialist with the Nature Conservancy. She is currently working on a project to build cross-sector collaborative network to address the impacts of ocean wastewater pollution. Prior to that, she worked at UCLA for 6 years as a researcher in Dr. Peter Kariva's lab and for the California Center for Sustainable Communities. Claire specializes in data analytics, particularly geospatial information systems, but she has worked on a variety of projects ranging in topic from environmental education to social justice. All right, over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, let me get this all started. Let's see. Is this working? Oh, let me just be at the end of my presentation. Okay, is that working for you guys?
Looks great.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'd just like to start off by thanking the Society for Conservation Biology for having me, as well as to Revive and Restore for coordinating the issue of this publication. As Michelle mentioned, I'm currently working at the Nature Conservancy and focusing on different research, but I was more than happy to dive back into this conversation since I think it's still so important from both a conservation and social critical theory standpoint. So the motivations for carrying out this research developed out of conversations with Peter Kariva and Michelle Marbier, both of whom have like far greater experience in the conservation space than me. But what prompted this is that we were interested in recovery action plans for endangered species and began questioning whether narratives surrounding hybridization as a risk are well-founded, particularly when hybridization may serve as a conservation intervention or could facilitate adaptation to rapid climate change. With these questions in mind, we began working to explore presumptions in the conservation field and ask if what empirical evidence supports hybridization as an extinction risk. It's hard to discern the origins of presumptions around hybridization, as a pervasive risk to biodiversity. There are several important literature reviews that attempt to go over this. In 1996, Weimar-Zimmer 3 of the 24 species that were listed under the ESA are now extinct due to hybridization. Another literature review by Tedesco in 2016 found that 48% of 143 case studies implicated these studies do not assess the type nor the quality of evidence underlying this claim. Anthropogenic hybridization has come under a lot of scrutiny and has rapidly increased with the introduction and translocation of non-native species, especially when coupled with habitat loss and fragmentation. It's commonly accepted among conservation biologists that hybridization can threaten biodiversity, particularly endangered and at-risk species with small populations. The mechanism is typically one considered hybridization to be abnormal and a human artifice up until emergence of modern evolution and then the
We seem to have lost Claire.
Yeah, why don't we take a pause on that? I'll work with her to figure out what is going on. Ben, do you want to go ahead and get your slides loaded up? We can just move directly to you.
Yeah, good idea.
So Ben Novak is the lead scientist for Revive and Restore. He helps to advance the use of biotech-based genetic rescue solutions. He coordinated Revive and Restore's black-footed ferret genetic rescue program, which recently reached its first milestone, the birth of Elizabeth Ann, the first cloned black-footed ferret. Ben's passion is Revive and Restore's passenger pigeon de-extinction effort, which aims to recreate the species and restore it to Eastern American forests. Ben, why don't you go ahead, and Claire, I will reach out to you in the chat.
All right. Here we go. Hello. Well, first, thanks everyone for being here. And sorry, Claire, that you are having some connection issues. Hopefully you get to present after me really smoothly. So Michele already introduced the paper I'll be presenting, which she is actually a co-author on, alongside Revive and Restore co-founder Ryan Phelan. This is a paper that I think we were really interested in, as Michele said, partly because, oh, we have someone in the waiting room, partly because our ambitious projects that we take on, we get asked about unintended consequences a lot. So you may know me most as familiar with the passenger pigeon project, as Michele introduced me. And a lot of people ask, what could go wrong putting a species that's been extinct for over a century back in its environment? And I am not the first person to publish that de-extinction is simply a translocation issue. These are the precursors, things like, well, here I'm getting ahead of myself. So yeah, so opponents, of course, are warning of harmful unintended consequences and can really prolong inaction. So a great case is in Colorado, where wolf introduction was delayed 20 years, partly because the state agency didn't want to accept authority. Fish and Wildlife Service didn't want to accept authority. And the proponents, although mostly economically and culturally driven, they used ecological consequences as a major foothold for their arguments that wolves would be bad in Colorado, despite the fact that simultaneously wolves were doing a great job in Yellowstone. And every time we talk about whether or not a translocation goes bad, or an intervention goes bad. We haven't really found many papers that quantify that. No one could really answer the question. So that's what we set out to do. And as far as things like the future of passenger pigeons or woolly mammoths go, there is the reason we went with translocations, especially for me and my specialty, is returning wolves to Yellowstone. One of the most famous cases is an example of what I consider de-extinction. So wolves were absent for 70 years, and then they put them back in the environment. And 70 years is actually a short time for some reintroductions. There are reintroductions that go back thousands of years with absence. Another great example of translocations for conservation is the Florida panthers, a great genetic rescue project in which new individuals were brought in to boost the diversity of a dwindling population and rescued it. These are just some of the different types of translocations that can be done for those conservation purposes. Those might be what come to mind most often, but translocations are incredibly common and diverse. And so we decided to try and tackle the United States branch of this, partly because we started looking at global translocations and realized there are just too many to try and for a small team of people to take on. I welcome everyone in the world to repeat this kind of study for their own nation and help build a database. So we took on the endangered species list first, partly because we knew that these would all be conservation motivated translocations. And first, I'll give just a quick overview of US biodiversity. So there's about 220,000 named species in the US and its island territories. This is the breakdown of their diversity. Most of those are invertebrates. And about 12,000-ish are species that have been introduced or reintroduced somehow, have been moved around. And at least 1,700 of those 12,000 were on purpose. They were not accidents. They weren't rats on a ship getting to Guam or something like that. They were on purpose for some reason or another. Very few of those, sorry, not very few, but some of those for conservation purposes. For conservation purposes, like reintroductions and reinforcements, like the wolf and the panther story I just told about, these have happened in every single US state and territory, which is not on this map, but they've literally happened everywhere. And so they've shaped ecosystems, even though they're a tiny percentage of the total diversity of the United States, they have shaped every ecosystem. We looked at the endangered species list and other databases along the way to compile what we consider as like the minimum number of species and subspecies and populations, unique taxa that have been translocated, and found 1,014 species with at least one attempted translocation. And the majority of these, there is at least one successfully established translocation. Our paper, in looking at the consequences of these, does not look at the first step, which is successful establishment, which is about 50-ish% rate of success. We looked at what happens after those organisms successfully get into the environment, and we looked for reports of any kind of net effect that could be considered damaging, using the invasive species model primarily, because that's really nicely summarized as being damaging, causing another species to rapidly decline, possibly go extinct, displacing populations, disrupting the environment in undesired ways, things like that. And for these 1,014 taxa, we couldn't find any examples of an entire ecosystem collapsing. We did find, and it's not on this slide, I apologize, but we did find one release of fish in the United States published in which they were introduced outside of their native range and they displaced a local population. Ecologically, they just kind of replaced that functioning population. But later, biologically, it was found that that native population was also unique and a restricted taxon. And so after the fact, people found out that that example reduced the global population of a now listed endangered species. So it's a really unique kind of case. And it's possible that there are more of those out there. I want to say that caveat. We are looking at what we could find, not just in peer-reviewed literature, but we looked at gray literature. We looked as many places as we could to find things that matched our criteria. And it could be that these things are not simply being published or reported, but we do believe that, you know, ecosystems completely falling apart due to translocations must be rare, simply from the fact that these are so widespread and have gone on for so long. And there are so few records of things completely falling apart because of these. Um, on the flip side to that one case where something bad did happen, translocations have been used very effectively to save species from the brink of extinction. Of the 1,580 taxa on the list, 42% have had at least one attempted and possibly one successful translocation. Some of these species have had many successful translocations. Translocations are also planned for another 28%, so they are in recovery plans and programs. They are acknowledged to be an important next step in the future. So we're going to be doing more of this stuff. So hopefully they don't end up getting delayed by major debates. And we hope this history helps smooth things out. For actual delisted and recovered taxa, the 47, at least 1 out of every 3 translocations played an important role in saving those species and getting the ultimate intended consequence, recovery and delisting. And just to show you how extensive these can be, bighorn sheep, which are a non-listed species, are translocated a great deal to maintain populations against disease, and have also been reintroduced after local extinctions. This is a map I got from the bighorn sheep group that shows every translocation pathway since 1922. There have been over 15,500 bighorn sheep translocated in the US, some of them translocated from British Columbia all the way down to New Mexico. This completely goes over subspecies boundaries. One of those subspecies actually a listed taxon. So undoubtedly in the last century, we have altered the population genetics of this species, but so far it seems to be working and doing really well, and they're very plastic. Another great example to show just how widespread these translocations can be is the story of the turkey, which is a huge conservation comeback, despite the fact that it happened before the Endangered Species Act. So it's never been a listed species. This is where turkey lived around 1500. By the 1930s, they had been extirpated from about 18 states. They survived in fragmented populations, and groups like the American Turkey Foundation Federation started transplanting them back where they used to live, and they started spreading from there. And they now live almost everywhere they used to live, but they decided, let's take them elsewhere, and brought them to the rest of the United States as well. Interestingly, there are Pleistocene records in the Western United States of turkey or other turkey subspecies. So depending on your baseline, these could be reintroductions as well. And in those introduced areas, we couldn't find reports that these turkey are causing disruption, but have actually just simply integrated and added to those ecosystems. So I think on everyone's minds when I give talks, they think, well, there has to be some cases of some really bad damage from an introduction or something. Where do these stories come from? Well, we all know the cane toad of Australia. It was introduced as a biological control in 1935 from Hawaii after it had been used as a biological control there. And what's interesting about this case is, one, scientists were against it, but were ignored, and the environment was not considered. It's interesting that this is a lesson learned. It definitely makes our thinking better, but when people bring this up in terms of relation to conservation, they're forgetting that this was not a conservation motivated introduction. There are other nuanced ones, one that we publish in our paper, that get fuzzy when they get retold again and again and again. A famous example by Ricciardi and Simberloff is the red squirrels introduced to Newfoundland Island, which are on record as the government saying, okay, this is going to be okay. We hope that they help the declining pine marten populations. But when you really investigate the original history of this, the original introductions were not approved by the government, and they were brought by game fur trappers to be a new game species on the island. This was not motivated by conservation. And the government basically, after the fact, said, okay, we're going to allow this we hope it does something for the pine martens. It was an afterthought. So it's inappropriate to point to this as conservation gone wrong, because that's not what went down. So we wanted to look at what is the breakdown of actual harm, the stories where we know things are bad. So we looked at invasive species. We found in the invasive species database 608 taxa that have been introduced to the United States and their territories, which are considered invasive from either a somewhat benign to a majorly invasive level. Only about 13% of those were released on purpose the first time. After some got established, maybe they were spread on purpose, but we're looking at initial cases of release. What's the original story here? And only 13% of these were released on purpose. Why were they released? Absolutely for cultural and economic reasons, to protect human interests. Most of these were not introduced in any way to help the environment. One of the major violators that people are familiar with is biological control, which can also be used for conservation. So we decided to do a review and focus in on that. There have been 697 successfully established biological controls in the United States, literally everywhere. The majority of those are insects, and only about 3% of them have been harmful. I actually think it's less. I have to redo my math on that. But it's a 21 out of 697. And as you see in the graph, most of those are not insects. They are animals from a bygone era when people thought, oh, weasels might be a good biological control. This is the actual history of global and US releases. As you can see, they've continued up until the 1980s. But globally, since the 1980s, there haven't been any examples of a newly introduced biological control becoming invasive. There's actually quite an eruption of them in the 50s and 60s. And since the United States started recognizing some of those issues on islands, they started rethinking. And actually, there are a number of laws that got put into place to start making this more strict, and the practice has completely changed. That's why we haven't seen bad biological controls in the last 4 decades, because people are thinking more like conservationists for biological control. And here I'd actually like to point out that unintended isn't always bad. A lot of people throw unintended in our faces like it's going to be bad. Here is a great case we found in our research where unintended was really good. The leafy spurge hawk moth is a widely used biological control for leafy spurge in the United States. It was introduced in several states, but it was never actually formally introduced in North Dakota. It was introduced into Montana, and an unintended consequence was that it spread hundreds of miles away to North Dakota, where there was remnant populations of an endangered orchid. And the other unintended consequence was that it started pollinating that orchid and is actually the #1 pollinator for this endangered orchid today, and has stabilized those populations, despite the fact that it is not co-evolved with this orchid and comes from Asia. So super cool story there. And here is a great story of biological control for conservation. Back in the 90s on St. Helena, scale insects invaded and were threatening the gumwood, a foundation species there, and models predicted absolute extinction of that species within 3 to 5 years. So they acted really quickly. They didn't debate a lot. They knew that this biological control, Hyperaspis pantherini, a ladybird beetle, had worked on other islands against this insect, so they brought it in. And within 2 years, they got it under control and saved those species. It was incredibly rapid results. They have not had an outbreak infestation since that has been difficult to combat. There's actually a number of uses of biological control in conservation, which is why we argued in our paper that biological control should be folded into conservation translocation terminology. Ultimately, as I said, biologically controlled shifted the way it did risk assessment and started thinking more like conservation. It's a great model for the way other translocations, such as for hunting or cultural reasons, could actually become safer and more benign in the environment, which we propose everyone look at as a model. There is a lot more in our paper, but I've only got a few minutes to give the big points, so I'll leave it to the question period after Claire gets to speak.
Okay, once again, we can throw questions into the chat box if you want to ask a question. Claire, I think you're going to get ready and post up your slides and talk. If there's anybody who wants to ask a quick question now of Ben, as Claire's getting ready, let's go ahead and do that. Okay, go ahead, Claire.
Okay. Sorry for that, everyone. Get back into it. So I was just talking about how this perspective of hybridization is divided between conservation biologists and evolutionary biologists. Historically, we've considered hybridization to be abnormal and of human artifice. And up until the emergence of modern evolutionary biology in the mid-20th century, was only when it became recognized as a natural process. And evolutionary biologists view hybridization as a source for genetic novelty and as a promoter of evolution. And genomic data has in fact revealed that introgression could lead to speciation or enhanced species survival. So this led us to ask, is hybridization truly one of the evil quartet of species extinctions? What data proves it? So we set out to assess the type and quality of evidence to ascertain the extent to which hybridization is a risk to biodiversity. We didn't want to consider any bias for or against hybridization. We simply wanted to identify what researchers were focusing on and the references they built their own research upon. In order to do so, we selected the IUCN's GISD to evaluate the evidence occurring among introduced species. The GISD was created in 2000 by the IUCN, and it's currently maintained by their Invasive Species Specialist Group. It was first populated with a list of 100 worst invasive alien species and now has over 800 profiles of animals, fungi, bacteria, protists, and viruses. In our search for species with hybridization as an impact mechanism, our database query resulted in 35 species. We then evaluated the bibliographies of those 35 to categorize each of the references. For each paper, we classified the data into two categories: evidence type and discussion topic. If the article included primary research, it fell into direct. Lit reviews and citations were indirect. Inferences based on a species family or generalized statements that hybridization is a pervasive threat fell into the no evidence category. For the discussion topics, we split into two categories to align with the mechanisms associated with extinction: proof of hybridization, typically via genetic markers or morphological studies, or change in fitness of the hybrid-generation from the parent species. Our findings evidence that there was limited data to substantiate claims that hybridization is a significant risk. 19 out of 35, or 54% of the species, were singled out as a hybridization risk without direct evidence of the occurrence of hybridization. 9 out of 35, or 74% of species, lacked direct evidence of a fitness change occurring in hybrid generation. This may be due in part to the difficulty in studying fitness changes longitudinally, especially between parent species and subsequent hybrid generations. Additionally, the data had enormous variability, with some having substantial genetic evidence and others claiming proof of a hybrid based on appearance alone. And we didn't want to discount the value of the indirect evidence, especially when IUCN experts may find it unnecessary to look back in the chain of evidence when they are indeed themselves experts. So we dove one layer deeper and evaluated the citations used in those indirect evidence sources for the species that were listed as having no evidence or indirect evidence. And unfortunately, those chains of evidence provided little. It became clear that these claims of hybridization are not well documented enough, whether because of technological or methodological barriers, to portray hybridization in such a negative light. So is this aversion to hybridization as a recovery tool unwarranted? And so it's interesting because in the past, we've successfully implemented it as an intervention, like the success story of the Florida panther. But is concern more about loss of local adaptation or loss of local phenotypes? We're in a world of rapid environmental change, where many species or populations may already be in disequilibrium with the local environment. So preserving local adaptations may be less important than introducing genetic novelties that could facilitate rapid evolution. This seems to be the case with California tiger salamander, a federally and state endangered species in Central California, which has been hybridizing with bar tiger salamanders introduced from Texas. These crosses have hybrid vigor, so they present the possibility of extinction via hybridization. But a recent study by Cersei et al. Found that the hybrids were better suited to a warming climate and would better fulfill the native salamander's ecological role then eradicating hybrids and having no salamanders at all. A study by Rowles et al. In 2020 goes even further by demonstrating that there's more empirical data that supports genetic rescue through hybridization. They found that attempts to evidence harms of introducing genetic variation in island foxes and Isle Royale wolves oftentimes revealed a methodological bias among conservationists when simulation modeling is dependent on assumptions of parameter limitations, as well as when genomic variants are uncertain indicators of fitness. In light of the paucity of data proving the supposed harms of all hybridization, it seems only logical to take each hybridization event case by case and consider it as a potential avenue for conservation intervention in specific context. Finally, it's important to unpack the historical and social implications of why hybridization has been represented as a negative force. Researchers are speaking brazenly about hybridization, but why? What made conservationists ascertain that hybridization was such a pervasive threat? And how do they discern the good from the bad, especially when evolutionary biologists didn't attach a value at all? Although invasion biology has been well critiqued, there has been little discourse on the topic of conservationist ethics, specifically in reference to hybridization. That said, those that exist shed much light on the topic. Bierman and Mansfield applied the Foucauldian concept of biopolitics to conservation by identifying scientists' prioritization of certain types of biodiversity, such as species or distinct populations, over the individual organism. Rower and Maris questioned the ethical motivations of promoting genetic or ecological integrity, which did not account for dynamism in ecological systems. They asked why we are considering anthropogenic change to be intrinsically bad. What is not often discussed is that the conservation movement of the early 20th century is a product of, unfortunately, white wealth. A conservationist by the name of Madison Grant, who is credited with establishing the Bronx Zoo, preserving the California redwoods, and saving bison from extinction, was also a renowned eugenicist who wrote the book, The Passing of the Great Race. Within, Grant used terms that bear surprising similarity to those used in discussions on hybridization, including swamping of the white man and maintaining a pure Nordic strain. He even discusses how half-breeds are inferior and should be prevented through miscegenation laws. He justified this scientific racism through arguments of natural law, which in fact radically shapes Nazi Germany's conceptualization of racial hygiene. Hitler actually referred to this book as his Bible. Of course, Grant doesn't single-handedly represent the whole of conservation, but it's fortunate to say that he shared the values of many of the founding fathers of conservation. This includes values we all respect: Teddy Roosevelt, John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, Aldo Leopold. These men were fearful of human population pressures and US immigration, and consequently became supporters of eugenics, isolationism, and white supremacy under the guise of social Darwinism. And I'm not bringing this up to invalidate the huge contributions they have made to the environmental movement, but rather to emphasize why we should adopt a revisionist lens, understanding how our social institutions influence our practices and knowledge today. So are we, as modern conservation scientists, objective in how we represent the data, or systemic racism baked into our approach? In an attempt to answer this question, we looked into the usage of racially charged language used to describe hybridization by conducting citation analyses in Google Scholar since the 1980s to coincide with the start of the modern conservation movement. As you can see in the chart, we calculated the frequency of publications discussing invasive species, hybridization, and conservation that use one or more of the value-laden terms: genetic contamination, genetic integrity, genetic pollution, and genetic purity. Evidently, there's a significant increase in racially charged language in invasion biology literature over time, which suggests this inherent bias in the conversation. Our findings indicate that we have a lot to learn about hybridization events. As we learn more about how to assess the impacts of their occurrences, we can better understand whether or not to let hybrid populations remain, or even deploy hybridization as a conservation intervention when species or ecological systems are at risk. For now, it seems we should evaluate on a case-by-case basis and work towards identifying criteria for easier management. Some researchers have created objective ways to evaluate hybrid populations through decision trees and other protocols that address factors, like if a hybrid could act as a surrogate for an endemic species, or if it allows for natural selection of native alleles. The socio-historical context, though, is much clearer in my opinion. Using terminology like genetic contamination and genetic purity in conservation biology not only allows an unjustifiable oversight and opportunities for saving species, but also gives legitimacy to xenophobia and racism. Those terms normalize racist ideologies and do nothing to further the conservation dialogue other than engage in fear-mongering. It's our responsibility as researchers and professionals to understand the repercussions of such rhetoric. In order to assess hybridization through an objective lens, it's time we evaluate our implicit and systemic biases in the process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Claire. All right, so we have plenty of time for questions. There are a few questions that have gone into the chat box. I want to remind everybody that, well, people have had more time to pose questions to Ben, but you can pose questions to Michele on the working group process, the consensus statement, the next steps for Revive and Restore, for Ben on translocations, and for Claire on that talk on hybridization. Thanks for each of you for those presentations. Ben, let's see, the first question I think came in for Ben was from Matt. Matt, would you like to ask that question?
Oh, yeah, I can. Yeah, I was just kind of thinking, you know, I have a, from my experience, I guess I have a different viewpoint of it, but I was kind of struck by the, I guess the way that Ben, you looked at, we're kind of providing the perspective of I guess the moth and orchid relationship in North Dakota, and I guess, you know, kind of the devil's advocate inside me wonders about, you know, basically using what we already have, and, you know, from your perspective in Revive and Restore and through genetic de-extinction efforts, I'm curious kind of what the argument would be to actually bring back some of these species versus actually taking, say, another convergent species from another continent and introducing in that way. So.
Yeah, so well, I'll share a personal story, because while our de-extinction projects get a lot of press, how we actually operate as an organization is not a sexy news story. So we've been approached by several people in the past wondering, you know, could we take on a project to de-extinct their local favorite extinct species? One of the ones we're researching right now is the extinct subspecies of peregrine falcons that lived on the Iwoto Islands of Japan. But peregrine falcons are already a great de-extinction success story here in the United States. The eastern population went extinct primarily due to DDT. It was the only population to completely go extinct due to that in the world, even though the whole world constricted. And back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, to reintroduce peregrine falcons, because it was unknown whether or not the local population was unique or uniquely adapted, and if any other population would really succeed, the team did something that I haven't heard of in any other program. They threw in a mixture of 7 subspecies from Eurasia, Africa, Australia, South America, and North America. So today, eastern peregrine falcons are actually a genetic mixture of 7 different subspecies, unlike any other genetic population in the world, and they do great. And so something we told that person when they contacted us was, is it possible that peregrine falcons from another island could simply come in and fill that role? So ecological replacement is definitely the first alternative to de-extinction. However, for species like woolly mammoths and passenger pigeons, there's absolutely no living functional equivalent. So I don't think de-extinction will necessarily become something that's incredibly widespread, but I do think the trend of restoring lost populations has been something that's slowly been increasing in frequency, mostly because we keep losing populations, so we need to keep restoring them. But there's always an abundance of alternatives.
Okay, great. So I'll throw a question out for Claire. So it seems to me that you dealt with one of 2 rationales for people opposing hybridizations in management, and that would be for you know, wilderness character, pristine nature of whatever was historically there. Another is that we think that species are often locally adapted and specialized in their location. And and this, in that, it seems like there's a differential ease with respect to assessing or detecting harm or benefit. So when you have a species that has an inbreeding problem, adding new genes, you might detect a benefit, but if you've added new genes and it causes a slight reduction in fitness, it might be really hard to detect that. And so I was just wondering if what you thought about in doing this assessment, whether you thought there was a sort of a detection bias problem in thinking about harm versus benefit.
No, that's definitely a really good take on that. I think that what was interesting to me was that when I was looking at the literature, the majority was not even about fitness. It was actually just about whether or not hybridization was occurring. And that's either like genetically or morphologically. And so that's where I was starting to really question why isn't the conversation about fitness? And as I mentioned, it could be because of the difficulties in studying it, and obviously it is like, it's hard, it's generational. It's something that like we don't have a lot of evidence on. And there's actually a paper that I referenced that discusses how maybe we could be tracking that when in like situations like fisheries where you could actually see those generational impacts. But I agree, it's a really hard, sticky situation. And that's when I came away with the feeling that like it's really an ethical issue that is, I don't know, that's where I felt about it. I don't know where Peter or Michele would come across, but yeah.
Okay, thanks. The next question, I think that was in the box, was from Claudia Sean.
Yeah, right. So you want me to ask it again? Yeah.
Sure, go ahead. Now, but I don't know if Ben answered in the box or not, but yes, go ahead.
Hi, from Germany. Yeah. At the beginning of his talk, Ben sort of introduced a list on how they selected animals that are threatened or extinct already. And I was just wondering if there's any kind of catalog or a list of rules how to choose whom to try to reintroduce next, like which areas sort of if you don't reintroduce the species missing there now, it might be too late next year, or is it mainly monetary restrictions or personal interest, or I mean, how do you go about after the peregrine falcon subspecies, who might be the next species to go for?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's actually an abundance of literature published on these things. The IUCN has a reintroduction and translocation guideline document. Scotland has its own Scottish code. Many places have documents published on how to go from beginning to end. The selection process is always a little vague. It's kind of baked in. Like, can you assure that the organisms being translocated are, one, going to be safely going to be able to persist in the environment themselves, and that the environment will be safe to them. Also, will they be safe to other things in the environment? So things like disease screening matter. Those are all technical. As far as actually choosing which species to work on, this ranges heavily from huge social cultural influence. Sometimes it's just because the species is iconic. People really want it back in its native habitat in their world view, or from very, from a biocontrol perspective, it's all about what fits the problem being faced. If they have a particular pest, then they go out and select something very specific. So it ranges from social to scientific, and whether or not things actually get approved for release, that's the important part. Is I think in almost every country, there has to be some type of actual government approval to release something. This doesn't prevent someone from doing it without approval, but to get approval, the person who decides will take into account both social and conservation factors. So there's a lot of promoting that has to go along, and lobbying that has to go along with people just committing to that. So far, I've seen no scheme that has prioritized certain types of urgent conservation species or functional species first.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I was involved at the beginning into this Amur leopard wildlife health project in the Russian Far East, and we had a concern mainly on diseases and where to relocate them, and then also their sort of genetic integrity is very difficult to keep. So both your talks were quite interesting for me today. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Hey, so I should also mention that you can just use the reaction button down in the lower bar and raise your hand if you'd like. But we have a question from Michele for Claire.
Hi, Claire. I just wondered, so it was interesting, sort of both you and Ben showed timelines, sort of how opinions are changing through time and how we've learned, right? The scientific research has established a literature that points to particular patterns. So I saw your timeline and that some of these terms, the frequency that we're seeing them in the literature is changing. But I also wondered, as the situation is getting more dire and we are losing more and more taxa, and for some of these endemics, the only option will be some sort of hybridization strategy. I wonder if you anticipate the pattern that you see on that timeline changing, or how that risk benefit calculation with respect to the values and the ethics might change.
Yeah, I think that it's really hard to tell, because I saw both sides coming where they're saying, oh, with climate change, like hybridization is going to really wipe out everything. And then there's the other side where it's like, this is an adaptation. This is a way to address these, moving populations and species moving around. So I'm like curious about myself. But I do think that it really, it goes back. It's interesting in how it's about this idea of what we think is, how do I say this? It's this idea of how our views of things are changing over time. And I think that really is, even within the last year, our perceptions of what is systemic, what's institutionalized is really important. And the idea of a lot of researchers thinking that artificial hybridization, so anthropogenic hybridization, is like the absolute worst, but then they're okay with natural, is like a weird cognitive dissonance thing that I can't wrap my head around fully, and I like want to look into it further. But it's definitely something that's going to change in this time, I would believe.
Okay, good. It looks like Ben has had to leave, but Doug Smith had an interesting comment that we might have reactions to. Doug, do you want to deliver that comment?
Yeah, I didn't think you'd call on me, Mark, but I guess I'll I guess I'll do it. Yeah, you guys have mentioned Yellowstone wolf reintroduction a fair bit. It was in the issue, and one of the most persistent and strongest criticisms is that we reintroduced the wrong wolf. There were originally 25 different subspecies of wolves in North America. The wolf that was in the Yellowstone region is extinct, but then a reclassification or new taxonomic work indicated there's only 5 subspecies, which is confusing to the public. How do you keep shifting this around? It's hard to explain that this is an artificial system, but nonetheless, a criticism that is virtually throughout all rural communities, political opposition, is the Canadian wolf is larger than the wolf that was originally here. It's genetically different, and it's devastating ecosystems. And no matter how we describe how things are named in the taxonomic literature, no matter how we say that these animals move around a great deal, there's very little difference. This criticism persists. You move something from one area of the country or the continent to another, and it's wrong. And this is more of a comment because it just won't go away. No matter how much science is brought to bear, this thing just keeps going. I think PBS is going to do a program on what happened legislatively in Idaho and Montana this winter, a big turn against wolves. And when the producer called me, that was the first question out of the gate. CNN's thinking of coming to Yellowstone. First question out of the gate, you reintroduced the wrong wolf. What has been the ecosystem consequences of that? And so every time you have to go back through it. And so, yeah, that was more of just a heads up. So.
Well, that's an interesting comment. I hadn't heard that one before, but certainly in my work with thinking about assisted migration, you get a lot of strong individual values based on sometimes rather scant information. But I think a lot of it relates to this idea that we all have an affinity to a natural, or well, people have an affinity toward a natural environment that they grew up in and they think is natural. So when you, for example, if you think that something might go extinct and you suggest moving it to a new location, if you tell the story of the imminent loss of the species, should we do something to save it? Raise your hand if you agree. Lots of people raise their hand. If you tell the story the other way around, saying, well, 800 miles south of here, there's a problem and they want to bring that species into our ecosystems, how are we in favor of it? Nobody raises their hands because they worry about whatever it might do to their ecosystems. And so there's all sorts of these very emotional responses to things that are very difficult to deal with, that I think are going to be a challenge in all of this in the future. So thanks for that comment. We are going to run out of time pretty soon. I don't see any more questions in the box. So what I wanted to do is give the last few minutes to Michele and just answer maybe the question of what's next for you guys in thinking of having done this work. Where do you go from here? Where do you take it?
Sure. That's the best question there is. I just will comment, following up on you and Doug, that there is another paper that is part of the issue that is questioning sort of this longstanding value of ecosystem integrity, written by Yasha Rower and Emma Maris. And I think Doug's comment, Claire mentioned it briefly in her talk, and what you just said about assisted migration right now, Mark, all relates to this idea that these ecosystems are constantly evolving and changing, and the time frame is so much longer than the scale of our lifetime. And so it's very easy to want to restore things back to the way it was when you remember your version of the golden days. But that really depends a lot on perspective. And they make some really good philosophical arguments that there are other ways to think about it. So I just would encourage, if that topic is interesting to you, to go look for that paper in the special issue. In terms of what Revive and Restore is up to next, so we are working as an organization to try to bring biotechnology approaches to conservation. And something that we come up in our work is constantly these questions about what about the unintended consequences and all of the issues that we've discussed today. And so really what we are thinking about on a larger scale is how to expand this narrative for conservation and how to get some of these positive stories out there. Why do we hear so often about the things that went wrong, even the things that were not directly related to conservation? And so a big part of our efforts now are trying to get these positive stories out there. So you may have heard recently about our success with the black-footed ferret, which will reintroduce genetic diversity into that population. We are also thinking about new solutions for the sylvatic plague challenge to the black-footed ferret. And then just more generally, we have some things that I don't want to say too much about, but upcoming on the themes of intended consequences. So we hope that that this term will make it out into public lexicon, and that conservationists will start this process of asking these difficult questions, really tackling some of the values and the ethics that are not a traditional part of scientific conversation, and that some of the talks we're doing here and other places and some of the written materials will help give you the tools and the language to have those difficult conversations. And then the other thing that we are working on, I'll just say a very little bit, is that we have we have come to the conclusion that as excited as we are about these biotechnologies, that the regulatory process is not straightforward at this point. And so, you know, there are guidelines out there and some processes for things like translocations and captive breeding interventions. But for some of the more advanced biotechnologies, each project is sort of having to win their way through the regulatory system individually. And so we are working to bring a group of people together to talk about that process and to think about some of these genetic interventions. I see Andy on there. I don't know that we're going to have time, but he's working with the American chestnut and is very up to date on the regulatory confusion. And so hopefully we will be able to come together and put together some guidelines that can sort of help guide these individual projects and maybe even eventually inform the regulatory process to make it a little bit smoother for all of the other projects that are bubbling up to solve these big conservation challenges. So I welcome you to reach out to us. I encourage you to go look for the special issue. And Mark, I thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Michelle and Ben and Claire, for some great talks. It stimulated some good conversation. I want to remind everybody that these go up on the Society's Vimeo site, so they're available to watch afterwards. And next week, June 16th, we have the talk investigating the international and Pan-African trade in giraffe parts by Christy Rupert. This is from the San Diego Zoo. This is also a paper that is coming out in Conservation Science and Practice. So that's a wrap on today. I'll stop the recording and thank everybody for coming, and maybe we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you all.